All right, folks, we'll get started. How's everybody doing? All right,
Pretty good.
good. Rachel, you staying warm? I don't know if she's paying attention to me. Good. Uh, just any questions where we're at in terms of uh, uh, class schedule? So we went through, finished up quiz 4. You guys as a whole really did excellent on that. Again, congratulations. We're about at the mid-semester point, so I'll be going through and posting up mid-semester grades so that you'll have those coming through. Now, the tricky thing with scoring in this class and grades in this class is a lot of your grade comes from your research participation. So what I'm going to do when I'm posting your midterm grades is assume that you've got I'm going to assume that you're going to finish with the required 6 hours of research. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your average, dropping your low score. I'm going to factor in the points that you would get having completed 6 hours of the required 6 hours of research, and then I'm going to post your grade based on that. But the important thing to remember is that if you go through and you don't complete all 6 hours of required research, that's going to be an overestimate of your grade. All right. So be careful there. Or if you get freaked out, or if it's lower than you'd like and you're starting to freak out a little bit, remember that if you complete all 9 hours that I'll credit you for, plus you don't miss any appointments or anything like that, so you get that extra credit bonus, it's going to be an underestimate. Your grade is probably going to be higher. Okay, that's the tricky thing, trying to say, oh, what's my grade in the class? I'd be like, well, it's this, but it kind of depends on how much research you complete at the end and if you do extra credit and things like that. So I'm going to go conservative. I'm just going to assume that you meet the requirements for the research for the class, but just know that that could be over or under depending on sort of where you end up at the end of the semester. Okay? Does that make some sense? All right, cool. Another thing, just in terms of, thinking about where we're at with stuff.
Someone did ask,
Oh,
when are the research credits due,
yep.
or the research time due?
Yeah, thanks, Cade. Just saw that pop up in the chat. Those are due last day of classes. So you've got till the end of the semester to go through and complete your research. Now, don't wait till the end of the semester, okay? Start right now. Get in while you can get into studies. Things are going to trail off, and there's going to be less studies right there at the end, but you have until the last day of the semester to go through and complete. So lots of time if you haven't gotten started, but make sure that you go on and get going with that. Also, if you're still not where you want to be, okay, and you're not, and so your quiz scores have been lower than you would have liked, understand these quizzes are challenging. I'm sort of asking a lot from you to sort of go through and integrate this material. But remember that these hours of research are a big boost, okay? So if you, and remember you get to drop a quiz, all right? If you're looking to get an A in the class, the score if you just get 6 hours of research and you sort of blow off one, you get a no-show, so you don't get a bonus. But if you just get the required 6 hours, the average that you need on your quizzes to hit an A is an 88%. So you don't have to have an A average on the quizzes in order to get an A in the class. And this is just with the bare minimum 6 hours of research. A 76 will get you to a B. A 64 will get you to a C. A D, which is technically a passing grade. If you're just taking psychology just to get that H course, a D will get you there. You don't want a D. Like, Ds aren't great, but they're better than Fs. But a 53% average, assuming that you get all of your 6 hours of required research, will get you a D in the course. So main point is that you're probably doing better than you think. But if you have questions, and many of you had, thank you so much for reaching out to me, Samantha, Natalie, about your grade, sort of developing better study habit or better approaches to study. You're probably doing better than you think you're doing if you're up on your research. But again, if you have any questions, make sure to go through and get in touch. Okay. Any questions on sort of grades, where we're at, where we're headed, anything like that? Okay, yep, Jonathan, I can't. Again, shout into your speaker because for some reason your mic doesn't pick up real well. What's that? One more time. Okay, Jonathan. Did you ask if the last lecture was posted? Okay, yeah. I was late on that. Posted it last night. Sent out an announcement. It's on there. It's 45 minutes. So just go through, take a look, getting into the basics of background of intelligence testing, pros and cons, and some of the theories and stuff like that. So go through. Apologies for that got away from me, but should be pretty straightforward. But if you have questions, make sure to go through and ask. Cool. So thanks for the reminder, Jonathan. Anybody else have questions? All right, cool. We'll jump then into material here, talking about how we go about developing sort of thoughts and making decisions and some judgment related stuff. I don't know. I think this is interesting because we start to get into technicalities of some really complicated questions for things that we just do naturally, things that we probably don't even sort of think about sometimes. But this is a lot of what psychology is doing, is saying what are the mechanisms? How do we go through and sort of form ideas and thoughts and things along those lines, and some interesting theories along these lines. Okay, so if I'm a cognitive psychologist, I'm going to be very specific about sort of some of my terms, right? If I sort of asked everybody to raise their hand, who doesn't understand what thinking is, no one would raise their hand, hopefully, right? We'd be like, oh yeah, you're thinking, you have thoughts go through your head, sort of whatever, right? But if we're going to go through and study this, we have to get pretty precise and start to break some of this stuff apart, right? If we're talking about thinking, right? This is a term that we throw around where we're just talking about the mental manipulation of information, right? So right now, as you are thinking about thinking, that's super meta. But as you're going through and considering sort of the material here, it's a form of thinking, right? We're always thinking. There's always stuff going through our brain. But if I'm a cognitive psychologist and I'm starting to study this stuff, what I'm going to do is start teasing apart different types of thinking and judgment. Okay. First thing we might talk about is going to be reasoning. Okay. This is going to be thinking directed towards a specific goal or objective, starting to draw conclusions based on some set of facts. Okay. So for example, what we're doing is we're using some logic, thinking about things. If you're sitting at a quiz, right, and I've presented you a question, it's a scenario like I often give you, and you're starting to say, all right, well, I know that, this relates to this material and this relates to this material, and it can't be this response because of this other thing that I know. That's all reasoning, right? And this is a higher form of evaluation that starts to get at some deep learning. So reasoning, we're using logic, we're using facts to try and come at solve some sort of problem. This is going to be different than judgment. Okay, judgment, we're going to evaluate and form opinions based on available information. Okay, so I might say, is Kate a trustworthy person? Like, I don't know. I'm going to have to go through and sort of take what I know about Kate and sort of like everything, like behaviors that I've seen, things that he's said, to try and weigh out sort of whether or not I should, Kate's trying to sell me a car. Do I trust Kate to sell me a car and not some sort of piece of junk that's going to fall apart? Okay. Or, I mean, we're coming up on an election here pretty soon. Like, this is judgment, right? Sort of weighing out candidates and saying, sort of, what have I seen? What are the facts? Sort of, who do I like you? So judgment, we're forming opinions. Decision making, going to be a different thing. This is the process between choosing alternatives, right? So maybe I go through and I make judgments about sort of a candidate for office, and I'm saying, okay, this is that and this is that, pros and cons. But then at the end, I have to make a decision. I have to choose, right? And this is a little bit different. And my decision might not it may be informed by my judgment. Generally, it will, but sometimes there's other stuff that goes in, right? If I'm trying to decide what am I going to major in at university, well, I like this. I like this. Psychology is cool, but I'm not going to make any money there. I like the engineering is fine, but it's hard, right? Sort of in going through and deciding sort of at the end of the day what decisions I'm going to make. So if I'm a cognitive psychologist, starting to go through and tease these apart and sort of be very specific in how we're going through and make sort of talking about these different constructs. Okay. Now, this is all sort of talking about a higher level, right? We're thinking about sort of, oh, do I like this or that, or how do I reason, and things along those lines. But if we get a little bit more specific, right, we get into this idea of concepts, right? We can't think, I don't know, it would be very hard to think. I don't know that we could think if we don't have concepts of things, right? And if we're talking about a concept, this is just some grouping of objects, ideas, people, some sort of thing that has some features, right, that sort of puts together into like this thing. It's a concept, right? So I would imagine, Brooke, that you have a concept of a dog, correct? Yeah. Can you identify dogs if you see dogs? Right? Because you have a concept of dogs, right? Now, let's say that Maya has never seen a dog before, right? I don't know why this would happen, but let's say you've come and you've never seen a dog before, right? It would be hard for you to understand dog if Brooke is talking about dogs because you have no concept of dog. I don't know what dog means. I don't know what it is, right? And so it would be hard for you to communicate, make assumptions about dogs, store information about dogs if you don't have a concept of what dogs are. Okay, this is why it starts to become so difficult when you're new to something like psychology, right? We talked about this interaction of working memory and long-term storage. You know, if I encounter something new, I'm reaching back into my long-term memory saying, like, where does this fit? It's similar to this concept, and I'm going to store it here. If I don't have a concept of these things that we're talking about in class, it's hard to retain this information and think about it because you have no framework, right? So concepts are essential for communication, sort of making inferences about things, storing information. As we start to develop concepts about psychological conditions, it's much, much easier to go through and hold on to that information, manipulate it, and store it. Okay. So, for example, if I say house, right, I assume that everybody as folks sort of at an English university or an English-speaking university in America sort of have a good concept of a house, right? But if I go through and I look at house in your brain, right, this concept, there's a lot of different things that could represent house, okay? We can have high-rises, we can have homes, we can have mobile homes, yurts and huts, pictures, icons of house. All of these things start to lead back to house, right? Same thing if I said work, right? You say, okay, work, I know what work is. But if we actually go through and start to define work, there's a lot of different things that could go on and start to define work, right? We've got student stuff. We've got sort of manual labor. We've got people working fast foods. We've got stockbrokers. We've got agriculturalists. We've got professional people in professional sports, right? So this idea of work has all sorts of different facets. But if I say work, you know what work is, even though there's a whole lot of different things that are represented or could go into this concept of work, okay? And so if I'm a cognitive psychologist, right, this thing about concepts, right, like it might not ever occur to you to think about how do we develop concepts, how do we organize concepts, and what do concepts do? But if I'm a cognitive psychologist, this starts to become a very important question, right? Because it's universal. We do this. And so the question is how do we formulate concepts? How does this all work out? Okay. And then what we can do in our sort of brain network is start to make connections between different concepts, right? This relates to this in this way. This is how this all integrates together, allows us to have complex thoughts, reasoning, logic, arguments, things like that. Okay? So how do we think about concepts? Like how do we formulate this idea of a concept? Early on, when people started working with this, an early model known as the defining attribute model. Okay, a defining attribute model says, well, what we do to develop concepts is that we have a list of necessary and sufficient conditions, features, in order for something to be sort of in this group. Okay, so the defining attribute model says what we do for some concept, we go through and we say these are all the things that are characteristics of this concept. If something has these characteristics, then they're a member of this concept. If they don't have these things, then they're not. Easy peasy, right? And it seems like it's sort of pretty straightforward explanation, right? Like, I know what things are. As long as these things have these features, then they're a part of that sort of group, right? So, someone help me out here. Hannah, will you help me out?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hannah, do you know what a bachelor is?
Yes.
Okay. I'm seeing, so right here on the screen, I've got identified a bachelor as young, single, male. Anything else that you would add to the defining features of a bachelor?
Not really.
Okay, that looks pretty good to you? Okay.
That sums it up, I'd say.
Okay, what about those guys? Do you think those guys look like bachelors?
Probably.
Probably, right? Right. These dudes, probably bachelors. These guys are young, they're single, they're male. They probably look like bachelors, right? What about that guy? Is that guy a bachelor?
I mean, could be.
Yeah, right. Would you normally, this is an organism that's young, single, I guess, and male, right? Would you put that into that bachelor category?
Probably not.
Probably not, right? So we're starting to see some failures here. What about that guy? Would you call that guy a bachelor?
No.
Why not?
Because there's not an alternative to being a bachelor at that age.
You don't know this guy's game. I don't know. He could be, right? This is the thing, right? So what we do is we start to see with this defining attribute model, things start to fall apart, right? What it assumes is that we have some all or nothing membership that includes something within a category, right? But we always make exceptions, right? So we say, okay, yeah, the Jersey Shore guys are sort of bachelors, fine, whatever. But then you throw up the pug and you're like, well, that's an animal. It has to be a human. Okay, well, what about now we got a kid, right? And so we just go down this rabbit hole. And it's probably not that every time we see something, we're presented with something new, we run through a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for whether or not this thing is a part of this sort of group or concept, right? And we have a lot of different concepts that would be very, very difficult to categorize as having necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So probably the defining attribute model kind of makes intuitive sense, but probably not how our brain goes through and processes concepts, okay? So an alternative model, something called the prototype model, okay? And the prototype model suggests that what we do maybe in terms of identifying membership in a concept is determine adequacy based on resemblance to a best example. So essentially what we say is we have some prototype in our mind, sort of like the perfect representation of this thing, right? And that's what then determines whether or not sort of this thing is or isn't sort of part of this group or concept, okay? So I want you all right now, okay, close your eyes, okay? And I want you to think about, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to, the first thing that pops into your mind, sort of the prototypical thing in your brain, okay? Ready? Bird. Okay? Open your eyes, right? I'm assuming that probably for many of you, this looks very similar to sort of what you would generally think about as your prototyped bird, okay? And the prototype model would say, if you're going through, let's say, Lindsay, you're walking through life, right? And you encounter something that you've never seen before, right? But what you do is you reference that to your prototypes of other things that you know about, right? And you would say, okay, this thing is something that has a beak. It kind of stands on two legs. It's got wings and feathers. This is going to be a bird, okay? And so to go through, and so the prototype model says we have some best example, and that's the basis by which we go through it and determine whether or not something fits into a category or not, okay? But did anybody have, when I said bird, or when you think about bird, does anybody have something that's very different or doesn't look like what we've got here?
I sort of had something different in mind. A little bit more mythological. I kind of thought of like a phoenix.
Okay, so Kate, so something like a more mythological sort of bird comes up, right? And so if we go through and if I were to survey each one of you, your prototype differs a little bit, right? And it's probably not, some of them are going to be pretty stereotypical, but depending on where you grew up and where you come from and things like that and what you understand as birds, if I grew up in New Zealand, I might have a very different sort of prototype for bird relative to somebody else, right? And so this starts to become problematic for the prototype model is because no matter sort of where we sort of go, people are probably going to go through and identify sort of birds as birds, right? Even though people are working with very, very different prototypes, which starts to become problematic because if we all have different prototypes, we should see less connection or so less agreement in terms of what constitutes a bird or what doesn't, right? And so, again, sort of this idea, and then sort of who determines what the prototype is, right? So even though we all have probably very different prototypes, we're also agreeing in the same way. And again, there still continues to be categories and things that don't have a good prototype, right? So if I ask you all to think about your prototype of a game, like what's a game? If I were to ask each one of you what your prototype is for a game, wildly different things, right? But even though we have wildly different ideas of what a game or sort of the perfect example of a game is, we can all probably pretty much come to an agreement on what's a game and what's not, okay? And so this starts to become problematic for the prototype model, right? So we got another, so this is a flying ocean fish or bird, right? So again, but we still identify this as a bird. So probably prototype model, again, probably not something, though, how we actually go through and determine things, okay? And so our sort of most recent model, the one that probably does the best job of sort of accounting for how we come up with concepts, something known as an exemplar model, okay? The exemplar model says that all members of some concept start to become incorporated into some concept that has no single one unique representation, right? So if I say bird, right, the exemplar model says that you take in your mind all examples of birds that you've come across in your lifetime. And so all of those things are kind of held. There's no single one bird. Not sort of bird isn't one thing. Bird is a large number of things that you've come to understand through your learning history. And so if I encounter something new, what I do is I take all those examples and I say, does this fit within this category? And then go through and sort of make a determination from there. Okay. So for example, for the idea of game, right? You have over the course of your lifetime a great number of things that you identify as games. If you're encountered with something new and you say, oh, it looks like people are competing and things like that, you take sort of this idea of game, put it together in your head and be like, yes, this is a game, or no, it's not. So there's not a single list of defining characteristics. There's not one prototypical example that's the best representation. It's just throughout my lifetime, I've collected all these exemplars of this construct. And then I'm going to go through and make a determination based on that. Questions about sort of these models of how we come up with concepts and start to sort of put this together. Interesting stuff and things you probably don't ever think about. You're like, oh yeah, I just sort of no ideas, and then it comes up and I've got it. But if we're cognitive psychologists, sort of we're very interested in the specific mechanisms of this. All right. So we switch over to reasoning and decision making. Same type of thing. We can start to say, okay, how do we go through and sort of what's the actual process that we go through and start to build impressions, judgments, come to solutions and answers. Okay. So a number of different ways we can go about this, right? First one would be an algorithm, okay? Algorithm is some systematic rule that we can use to go through and sort of arrive at a solution for something, okay? Think about long division, right? Or any of you who are out there who are sort of working, say, mathematics engineering or something like that. For a lot of our sort of basic problems within sort of these areas, if I go through, I have a system. If I follow the system, if I work through these steps and I don't make any errors, I'm going to arrive at the correct answer, okay? If I sort of go through and follow the steps that I was taught for long division, I'm going to get the right answer every single time, okay? So this is an algorithm, right? So for example, let's say, Jacob, let's say you go through and you get a phone number from somebody. It's an important phone number. Did you want to sort of make sure that you've got this phone number because it's important that you get in touch with this person, but you got everything except the last digit. If you needed to, how could you go through and sort of make sure that you get in contact with that person?
I could just try every number.
Yep. You could just start with 0 and sort of type in the number 0. Did I get it? Nope. 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be an algorithm, right? And so we use algorithms sometimes, right? The problem is that algorithms aren't super efficient, right? And if we think about all the decisions and all the stuff that we need to decide on a day-to-day basis, if I had to go through and sort of work through a very specific algorithm to determine whether or not I should or shouldn't do something, or whether or not I should do this or that, or making decisions in judgment, it would be too much. It would start to become problematic, right? The other thing too, as you have probably noticed in sort of areas like psychology, where sort of a lot of the stuff we're working on don't have clear definitions. There's not an algorithm that will go through and arrive at the right answer every single time, right? And so the problem we got, algorithms are great for certain situations, but overly rigid, oftentimes there's not an algorithm for it, takes way too long to go through and do things. And so while we use algorithms, there's some limitations. And so we have to have other types of approaches to making decisions if we're going to navigate life effectively. Okay. So again, these algorithms are going to be time consuming, resource intensive. I just don't have the mental capacity to run everything through an algorithm as I'm sort of moving across different decision points in my life. Okay. And so what we have instead are heuristics. Heuristics are going to be some strategy that we use to make quick snap judgments decisions. Okay. So let's say, Cameron, you're masked up, buddy. I see you there. But let's say that you go through, last time you went out to the grocery store to buy, so tell me something you decided to buy.
It's just like whole grain oats.
Whole grain oats. Okay. So this is a great example. So you go to the store looking for whole grain oats. How many sort of different types of whole grain oats are there on the shelf?
There's a couple, like the Great Valley brand, Quaker.
Okay, right. So you go through, and so you got the maybe the generic brand, and then the Quaker oats, and then maybe some other types of sort of look fancier, right? So you got your hipster oats and stuff like that start to get more expensive, right? You've got your pesticide-free organic oats, and it starts to become overwhelming, right? And this happens a lot of times when we go through. And so if I'm going to decide on, so I'm looking at my shelf of oats, right? And think about in terms of buying, what do we often do to try and decide which one is probably the best quality, best brand, best quality product?
Probably looking like the labeling or stuff like that, like the label.
Okay.
How it's designed.
Okay, so Cameron's looking at the label to determine quality of a product. Cameron's a better person than most of us. What do we normally do? If we're trying to gauge the quality, the price, right? If the price is high, I'm assuming that that's a quality product, right? And if we go through and we take a look at generics, right? We say, oh, generics, that's probably a garbage product because it's cheap. This other thing, the hipster oats, those are like 4 times the price of the generic oats. Those are probably better quality, higher level stuff, right? But this is just a heuristic, right? Sometimes, right, we're able to go through, and sometimes higher price is indicative of higher quality, but not always, right? And so these heuristics are things that we can go through, allow us to make snap judgments, because if I have to go through and read the label for every product that I buy as I go to the grocery store, I'm going to spend a lot of time at the grocery store, right? And so we have sort of price, name brands are better than generics, right? Is a heuristic. If we think about other heuristics, things that we go to, I avoid walking down. So if I'm in a new city in town, right? And I'm sort of trying to get back to my hotel. Let's say I'm out on a sort of pre-COVID when we're sort of moving around and stuff like that. Got 2 paths. One looks like not a super lit path. Other one looks like a sort of pretty lighted street going where I'm going. Which one do I choose?
The lit path.
Why?
Because
Yeah, because it's safer. Because lit passes are safer, right? Streets that have lights on them are probably safer. Ones that don't have are probably not safe. And maybe sometimes that's true, but in other times it's maybe not, right? And so again, this is a heuristic. These are just quick judgments. We're taking information, sort of compiling it together to make quick snap judgments that allow us to move through life much more efficiently, but they're prone to error. Our algorithms, those are error-free. As long as we follow them correctly, we'll always arrive at the right solution, but they're slow and time-intensive. Heuristics, quick. We can go through and oftentimes make some pretty good judgments, right? Again, if I'm in a sort of a big city that I've never been to and I have a sort of path or a street with lights and one without, I'd probably best to go on the one with lights, right? But I'm not always going to be right. I'm going to make some errors there, okay? So heuristics, a nice strategy, but prone to error. I can also start to make decisions based on insight, right? Think about this. Do I have anybody who's, I don't know, in this just mathematics, engineering, sort of one of those fields, chem?
No, definitely not.
Yeah,
Who's that? Who gave me a
Declan.
Declan? All right. So Declan, have you ever been sort of working on a project? And again, I started out in sort of engineering, sort of have these math classes and stuff like that, and you're just pounding your head, can't figure something out, and then all of a sudden, light bulb comes on. You're like, oh, that's it. Boom! I have some insight into this problem, and I'm able to go through and say, okay, this is where I'm this is the solution. It was sitting right in front of me the whole time. And now everything falls into place. You ever have that type of experience when we're working through stuff?
All the time.
Okay.
That's basically it.
Right? And so insight is fantastic, right? When we get hit by that lightning bolt, it's tremendous, right? Now, all of a sudden, I think all hope is lost. I see the solution, and now everything falls into place. Insight is fantastic, but it's unpredictable, right? If I decided to go through my life and just wait for insight to strike me before I made any type of decision, I probably wouldn't get very far. It's great when it happens, but it's unpredictable and oftentimes not as a reliable approach as our algorithms, as our heuristics, right? And so insight is great. It happens. But if we're waiting around on insight, we're going to be sad for a lot of the time, right? Last thing we sometimes use to make decisions are intuition. This is our gut belief. These are conclusions, these are beliefs that I have that are based on very little explicit knowledge. If you ask me why I picked this over that, I say I don't know. It just feels right. It just feels like I just feel like this is the right thing to do, right? And again, this intuition can be very, very helpful. Sometimes when we're going through and going through life, there are things that we can't sort of put our finger on, but there's just something that starts to make me feel, oh, maybe this isn't a great situation, right? This Maya person seems sketchy. I can't put my finger on exactly what's going on, but I just don't get a good feeling about this, right? And this is where we come into our intuition. Now, we can start to pick up on things that we can't put our finger on, but oftentimes our intuition isn't based on anything. It's not factual, right? It's just part of how I feel. And sometimes how I feel isn't really based on reality. It's just how I feel, which is sort of how you feel, which is fine, but it's just not something that's based on intuition, right? Going with my gut all the time is probably going to lead me down roads where I don't want to be, or sort of run me into roadblocks if I was taking a more sort of reasoned approach. Okay. So if we're thinking about reasoning and decision making, we use all of these, right? So if we're being flexible and approaching, sometimes we're using heuristics, algorithms, insight hits us sometimes, which is nice. Sometimes we're just based on our intuition. But again, all of these being different areas or different approaches to making different types of decisions. Right. But sometimes we run into problems where we're trying to make decisions. We're kind of trying to come up with reasoned approaches to things, but we end up running into problems, right? We just can't, we seem to be running into wall over and over and over again, and we just can't shake it loose. We can't arrive at the solution that we're looking for. And a lot of times this ends up being our tendency as humans towards confirmation bias, okay? Confirmation bias is our tendency to look for information that supports sort of things that we already believe, and we start to ignore things that don't, or that things that don't fit with our sort of overall perception of something, right? I have an idea that this is the way things work in the universe. And so what I'm going to do as a human is I'm going to be sort of more drawn to those things that are consistent with how I think and feel, and those things that are contrary to how I think and feel, I'm going to systematically ignore them. And a lot of times it's not intentional, right? We don't even notice that we're doing this, but it's just part of being a human, okay? Cameron, will you help me out again? Okay. What I'm going to do, Cameron, is I'm going to go through and I'm going to read you a list of 3 numbers, okay? And when I list those, and I'm going to tell you those 3 numbers, and then I'm going to ask you for what the rule is for those numbers, okay?
Okay.
All right. So my numbers are 2, 4, 6. Give me, hold up. Give me 3 digits that follow the same rule.
2, 4, 6.
Yeah.
8, 10, 12.
Yep. Okay, that follows my rule. What's my rule?
Plus 2.
No, that's not my rule. Okay. Give me another set of numbers.
14, 16, 18.
Yes, that follows my rule. What's my rule?
I don't know. What do you mean?
Yeah. So what's my rule? I got a rule for this. What's my rule? What's that? Even numbers. That's not my rule. That's not my rule.
Add 2.
Yeah. So give me another set of numbers. One more set of numbers.
22, 24, 26.
Yep, that follows my rule. What's my rule?
I don't know, man.
Okay. This is a classic, and what we've done. Thank you, Cameron. You've failed wonderfully, exactly in the right way I wanted you to do. And it's because almost everybody will do this. What we saw there was an example of confirmation bias, right? I set you up. I said 2, 4, 6, right? This is how we count by 2s. My actual rule, any 3 ascending numbers. You could just add 1, 8 million, 10 million, right? And I would be like, okay, that's it, right? But you didn't. What you got locked into is this confirmation bias, right? And you didn't even realize it, right? What you heard was 2, 4, 6. Those are even numbers that increase by 2s, right? And even though I told you that wasn't my rule, you continue to go back to that rule, right? Because we got stuck in that, right? And so this is a great example of confirmation bias. Watson wrote a paper, and people will almost always fall into this, right? And so what we see is this really, really strong tendency as human beings to sort of fixate on something that we think is an answer, even though it's not the answer, even though we've found that it's, yes, this is not a right thing to do, but then we still keep doing it. Declan?
Yeah.
Have you, same thing with some of the sort of higher level math and stuff like that. Have you had situations where you sort of run into a thing and you just basically keep using the same strategy over and over and over again, even though it's never worked?
Yeah, that happens quite a bit.
Happens quite a bit, right? And so what we do is we start to narrow our vision with this confirmation bias, and we start to lose the stuff going on around us, right? Even though we're getting clear signals that what we're doing or the approach that we're taking isn't helpful, still continuing to do this, right? We often also see this with conspiracy theories. I imagine, and I'm not going to ask anybody, but you probably have a friend, a relative, someone who's big into conspiracy theories, right? Stuff that is clearly not true. I'm sorry to break it to anybody out there. The world is not flat, right? We do not live on a disc. The world is for sure not flat, right? But we got people out there who are very, very convinced that the earth is flat earthers, and they sort of, some bad stuff has happened trying to prove the earth is flat. You don't need to put that time and effort into it because I assure you it's not, right? But again, what we see is confirmation bias, ignoring evidence against sort of my beliefs, and only... Jacob, I'll talk to you during office hours. So ignoring the evidence sort of against sort of what we do. And so conspiracy theories maintained by this. In psychopathology, we see this a lot too, right? What we know about people who struggle with depression have beliefs about, very strong beliefs and assumptions about sort of their self-worth, their ability to sort of do things, whether or not people sort of like them, things along those lines, right? And if you've ever struggled with depression or known somebody who has, you get in this dark place where you think, I'm worthless, things are never going to be right for me, nothing ever goes right, I'm garbage, I can never, so no one will ever love me, I don't have any friends, right? And if you talk to people around you, like, what are you talking about? You're hugely successful. You've got a lot of people who care about you, but again, it's this confirmation bias. I'm only focusing on those things that are consistent with my depressive thoughts and ignoring everything else, right? So we see this confirmation bias all the time, okay? We also see sort of kind of similar sort of mental set, right? Mental set refers to a tendency to approach a problem from a particular perspective and ignore other ways of going about and approaching things, right? We start to get into, similar to confirmation bias, but we get into this rigid structure where we're having a hard time seeing a solution, okay? Now, if we were all in class, I would draw this on the board and ask one of you wonderful people to come through and help sort of solve a problem, right? So what we've got here is what we call this is a 9-dot problem. So the idea here is what I want to do is I want to go through and in one line, without lifting sort of my pen, and we would be doing this on chalkboard, run a line through all 9 of these dots without sort of going backwards or retracing or lifting up your pen, okay? And so if I had someone come up, and unless you already know the solution, this is what people always do. So I go through, okay, so I'm going to go through, and I'm going to, here we go, do this. So, okay, I'm going to go here, 2, 3, 4. All right, so I got 4 lines. That didn't do it. All right, so I try again, and I say, okay, well, maybe I go here, 2, 3, 4. That didn't work, right? And so what we do is I can sit there and keep going through and trying to find, I need to draw 4 straight lines that goes through all of these without lifting my pen or picking up or going back over something, right? 3, 4, I miss it, right? But if you've seen this puzzle before, you know that the solution involves something that if I go through here, start there, go up here, go down here, and then go there, now I've solved that problem, okay? Daniel, why couldn't I solve this problem? Or why is it difficult for people to solve this problem?
Because they were thinking, I have to start on a dot and maintain my boundaries within those dots.
Yeah, exactly. When I see this, I'm immediately caught in a mental set where I see the boundaries of this dot grid as sort of the limitations of what I never said you couldn't go outside of it, right? But what I'm doing is I'm seeing this being the boundaries, and then so I'm going through and trying to go through and do my thing, but I'm never going outside. And so once you see the solution, then you're like, oh yeah, for sure, right? But it's very difficult for people to go through and solve this type of puzzle without some help, okay? And again, if any of you are interested in puzzles or sort of problems and sort of things along those lines, this is a lot of what it is. It's sort of creating a mental set or getting people into a mental set that's very difficult to sort of shake in order to achieve a solution. So again, these are all things that can start to go through and impact our ability to see solutions, even if they're sort of not terribly difficult. Okay. All right. Questions about mental set, confirmation bias, anything like that?
Dr. Clapp.
Yeah.
For the confirmation bias, is there like ways to reverse it, or is it just kind of, always there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Maya. It's kind of always there. We are all prone to confirmation bias, right? We like to be right. No one likes to be wrong, right? No one's like, oh yeah, no, I was way off on that, right? No one feels good about that, right? And so we will have a tendency to go through. The best thing we can do is recognize that we're prone to this, like this is something, and being open to information that's maybe inconsistent with what I think, or sort of how I think things go. And so then trying to carefully evaluate and sort of weigh out evidence and things. This is a huge thing in research, right? We talk about research as being objective. And we've tried to put in systems with the scientific method that we try and be objective, right? But if I'm going in and running a study, I'm running a study because there's something that I thought was going to turn out. And if it doesn't, what I can keep doing is run the same study over and over and over again, and my effect never comes out. After a while, I have to be open to the possibility that my effect that I think is sort of an effect isn't actually what goes on, right? And so it just happen to be open, and it's hard, but open to sort of contradictory information, stuff that I would prefer not to be true, but could be true, right? And sort of weighing out the evidence and engaging things out. Yeah, so, but as human beings, it's a hard thing to sort of get ourselves out of this confirmation bias. Well, the best we can do is sort of try and introspect and catch ourselves and say, am I sort of just only hearing what I want to hear in this situation? Good question, Maya. All right. Other things that can start to go on. How about we have something known that we refer to as availability heuristic. Okay, an availability heuristic involves sort of our estimation of the likelihood of some event based on similar things that come up. Okay. If I can think of an example, even if it's an example that is rare or actually has never ever occurred, what that starts to do is that example that's very, very easy to access starts to increase my estimate of how likely something is. Okay, so if I were to say, how about this? And people, give me a shout out if you have sort of some thought or belief. So what's the likelihood, assuming that we weren't in the middle of COVID, Halloween's coming up, what's the likelihood of a kid getting poisoned by candy on Halloween? What do you think, Brooke?
I hope like relatively low.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I also hope that it's relatively low. Anybody have like a percentage? What's the percentage likelihood that some kid in the state of Wyoming will be poisoned by candy intentionally?
1%.
1%. All right. Cameron says 1%. That's not very high, right? But honestly, Cameron, anything above 0% is probably too high, right? Because again, it's one of these things, and sort of like same thing back, oh, so someone got razor blades in their candy bar on trick or treat, right? Like we hear that, right? That's something that sticks in our memory. That's horrific, right? Like back, oh, I'm just eating a candy bar and some sociopath slips a razor blade in it, right? It's an urban legend, but there's never actually been a documented case of that ever happening. But it's really easy for us to go through and bring that up to mind, right? And so what we do is it starts to increase the our estimate of the likelihood that could happen, okay? Where we see this a lot, casinos. There's someone who's enjoys gambling or likes to hit a casino every now and again. Cade, was that you-ish? Okay. Cade, if you go into a casino, what's going on? If you go on a casino floor, what's happening? What are you seeing, or what are you hearing?
Here's a bit of people talking, some chips moving around.
Okay, what are those
people
slots?
walking around.
What are those slots doing in the background?
They're rolling and changing.
Okay, yeah. So in the background, Vance is an extremely lucky gambler. That's awesome, right? And so when Kate or Vance, you go into a casino, what you're hearing is you're hearing sort of alarms, right? Like you're hearing stuff that sort of sounds super positive, right? People are going through, and you hear like sort of chimes going off, and you hear tokens dropping, and you hear basically stuff that sounds like people winning, right? Are people winning? No, people are losing. No, casinos don't make billions of dollars because people win all the time. And so what you're doing is that casino is setting things up to capitalize on your availability heuristic. It's easy to go through and think about like, oh, that person that won big on the roulette table, right? They laid their money on double zeros, right, and stuff like, and then they won, thousands and thousands of dollars. Or someone pulls a card at the last moment and they sort of win big. I hear those casinos all going in the back every time. What happens when you lose at a casino? Does that or at a slot machine? Does that machine go wah wah, or sort of give like a sort of a big bozo sound? No, you don't hear about people losing, right? You think about Las Vegas or sort of places like that. You'd be like, oh, yeah, no, I know my buddy went there and sort of went and sort of paid for the trip and so blah blah blah, this and that and the other thing. Yeah, we don't think about the person who went there and just lost their shirt sort of going through, right? And so what it does is it capitalizes on this availability heuristic. I can think and come up very easily the person who just won big, and when in the background I'm hearing all these slots that sound like people are winning, and so it makes me more likely to think that I'm going to win because that's much easier to hang on to and remember than sort of the alternative, okay? So again, just an example of this availability heuristic. After you guys are getting sort of too old or it's starting to be too long ago for some of you all, but 9/11 attacks, right? I was an undergrad here in Laramie when I had just transferred in, right? And I remember sort of waking up, had a buddy who was an engineer who had earlier classes than me say, hey, something's going on, right? Immediately after that, if you asked people the likelihood of, like, no one was flying at that point in time, right? Because you had this huge thing in your head where the idea was flying was unsafe, right? But in fact, right after those attacks was probably the safest time to fly ever, just because the security was so tight, right? But again, this availability heuristic, sort of this idea, those images of that sort of sticking in my mind, and sort of starts to increase the likelihood of similar events. Okay, so again, something that we're all prone to. Best we can do is kind of know that this exists and sort of try and sort of evaluate our assumptions. But again, a very, very hard thing to escape as just sort of being a part of the human race. So cool. All right, folks, went a little bit over, but thanks. We'll pick back up with this material on Wednesday, and then move forward into sort of our second intelligence lecture. So go ahead. Thanks for hanging out. But if you want to stick on, if everybody has any questions, any questions?
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Let me pull my notes back on my desk. What's the difference between a concept and perception?
So a concept, Cameron, that's a good question. A concept, think of anything you can think of. If I just had you start naming words, all those things would be concepts, right? Hat, mask, eyes, intelligence, concept is a concept, right? All of these things, a concept is just a thing, okay? Perception is sort of a different area of cognitive psychology that it just involves my ability to sort of see you, hear you, sort of that type of thing. So concepts are just things. Concept is just a fancy word for thing or groups of things.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. Anything else?
No, sir, that's about it.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have questions or comments on anything? All right, awesome. You guys are doing fantastic. Keep after it. Let me know if you're running into any questions. And otherwise, we'll either see you in office hours or catch you on Wednesday. All right. See you, folks.